Damned If You Don't, by Randall Garrett. The workshop laboratory was a mess. Sam Bending looked it over silently. His jaw muscles were hard and tense, and his eyes were the same. To repeat what Sam Bending thought when he saw the junk that had been made of thousands of dollars worth of equipment would not be inadmissible in a family magazine, because Bending was not particularly addicted to four-letter vulgarities. But he was a religious man, in a lax sort of way, so repeating what ran through his mind that gray Monday in February of 1981 would be unfair to the memory of Samson Francis Bending. Sam Bending folded his hands over his chest. It was not an attitude of prayer. It was an attempt to keep those big, gorilla-like hands from smashing something. The fingers intertwined, and the hands tried to crush each other, which was a good way to keep them from actually crushing anything else. He stood there at the door for a full minute, just looking. The lab, as has been said, was a mess. It would have looked better if someone had simply tossed a grenade in it and had done with it. At least the results would have been random and more evenly dispersed. But whoever had gone about the wrecking of the lab had gone about it in a workmanlike way. Whoever had done the job was no amateur. The vandal had known his way about in a laboratory, that was obvious. Leads had been cut carefully. Equipment had been shoved aside without care as to what happened to it, but with great care that the shover should not be damaged by the shoving. The invader had known exactly what he was after, and exactly how to get to it. And he, whoever he was, had gotten his hands on what he wanted. The converter was gone. Sam Bending took his time in regaining his temper. He had to. A man who stands 6'3", weighs 300 pounds, and wears a 48-size jacket can't afford to lose his temper very often, or he'll end up on the wrong end of a homicide charge. That 300 pounds was composed of too much muscle and too little fat for Sam Bending to allow it to run amok. At last he took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and let his tense nerves, muscles, and tendons sag. He pretended someone had struck him with a dose of curare. He let his breath out slowly and opened his eyes again. The lab still looked the same, but it no longer irritated him. It was something to be accepted as done. It was something to investigate and, if possible, avenge. But it was no longer something to worry about or lose his temper over. I should have expected it, he thought wryly. They'd have to do something about it, wouldn't they? But the funny thing was that he hadn't expected it, not in modern, law-abiding America. He reached over to the wall switch to turn on the lights, but before his hand touched it, he stopped the motion and grinned to himself. No point in turning on the switch when he knew perfectly well that there was no power behind it. Still? His fingers touched the switch anyway, and nothing happened. He shrugged and went over to the phone. He let his eyes wander over the wreckage as his right index finger spun the dial. Actually, the room wasn't as much of a shambles as it had looked on first sight. The burglar hadn't tried to get at anything but the converter. He hadn't known exactly where it was, but he'd been able to follow the leads to its hiding place. That meant that he knew his beans about power lines anyway. It also meant that he hadn't been an ordinary burglar. There were plenty of other things around for a burglar to make money out of. Unless he knew what it was, he wouldn't have gone to the trouble of stealing the converter. On the other hand, if he had... "Police department," said a laconic voice from the speaker. At the same time, the blue-clad image of a police officer appeared on the screen. He looked polite, but he also looked as though he expected nothing more than a routine call. Bending gave the cop's sleeve a quick glance and said, "Sergeant, my name is Samson Bending. Bending Consultants 3991 Marden. You'll find it in the phone book. Someone broke into my place over the weekend, and I'd appreciate it if you'd send someone around." The sergeant's face showed that he still thought it was routine. "Anything missing, sir?" "I'm not sure," said Bending carefully. "I'll have to make a check. I haven't touched anything. I thought I'd leave that for the detectives. But you can see for yourself what's happened." He stepped back from the screen, and the Linster cameras automatically adjusted for the greater distance to the background. "Looks like you had a visitor, all right," said the police officer. "What is that? A lab of some kind you've got there?" "That's right," Bending said. "You can check it with the register." "Will do, Mr. Bending," agreed the sergeant. "We'll send the technical squad around in any case." He paused, and Sam could see that he'd pressed an alarm button. There was more interest in his manner, too. "Any signs that it might be kids?" he asked. Sam shrugged. "Hard to tell. Might be. Might not." He knew good and well that it wasn't a J.D. gang that had invaded his lab. He grinned ingratiatingly. "I figure you guys can tell me more about that than I could tell you." The sergeant nodded. "Sure. Okay, Mr. Bending, you just hold on. Don't touch anything. We'll have a copter out there as soon as we can." "Okay?" "Okay," Sam agreed. He cut off as the cop's image began to collapse. Sam Bending didn't obey the cop's order to touch nothing. He couldn't afford to, not at this stage of the game. He looked over everything, the smashed oscilloscopes, the overturned computer, the ripped-out meters, everything. He lifted a couple of instruments that had been toppled to the floor, raising them carefully with a big screwdriver, used as a lever. When he was through, he was convinced that he knew exactly who the culprit was. Oh, he didn't know the name of the man, or men, who had actually committed the crime. Those things were for the moment relatively unimportant. The police might find them, but that could wait. The thing that was important was that Bending was certain within his own mind who had paid to have the lab robbed. Not that he could make any accusations to the police, of course. That wouldn't do at all. But he knew, he was quite certain. He left the lab itself and went into the outer rooms, the 3 rooms that constituted the client's waiting room, his own office, and the smaller office of Nita Walder, the girl who took care of his files and correspondence. A quick look told him that nothing in the offices had been disturbed. He shrugged his huge shoulders and sat down on the long couch in the waiting room. Much good it may do them, he thought pleasantly. The converter won't be worth the stuff it's made of if they try to open it. He looked at the clock on the wall and frowned. It was off by 5 hours. Then he grinned and looked at his wristwatch. Of course, the wall clock was off. It had stopped when the power had been cut off. When the burglars had cut the leads to the converter, everything in the lab had stopped. It was 8:17. Sam Bending lit a cigarette and leaned back to wait for the cops. United States Power Utilities, monopolated, had overstepped themselves this time. Bending Consultants, as a title for a business, was a little misleading because of the plural ending of the last word. There was only one consultant, and that was Samson Francis Bending. His specialty was the engineering design of atomic power plants, both the old-fashioned heavy metal kind and the newer, more elegant stellarators, which produced power by hydrogen to helium conversion. Bending made good money at it. He wasn't a millionaire by any means, but he had enough money to live comfortably on and enough extra to experiment around on his own. And primarily it had always been the experimentation that had been the purpose of Bending Consultants. The consulting end of the business had always been a monetary prop for the lab itself. His employees, mostly junior engineers and engineering draftsmen, worked in the 2-story building next door to the lab. Their job was to make money for the company under Bending's direction, while Bending himself spent as much time as he could fussing around with things that interested him. The word genius has several connotations depending on how one defines a genius. Leaving aside the Greek, Roman, and Arabic definitions, a careful observer will find that there are 2 general classes of genius, the partial genius and the general genius. Actually, such a narrow definition doesn't do either kind justice, but defining a human being is an almost impossible job anyway, so we'll have to do the best we can with the tools we have to work with. The partial genius follows the classic definition. A genius is a man with a one-track mind. An idiot has one track less. He's a real wowzer at one class of knowledge and doesn't know spit about the others. The general genius doesn't specialize. He's capable of original thought in any field he works in. The trouble is that, because of the greater concentration involved, the partial genius usually gets more recognition than the general. That is, if he gets any recognition at all. Thus, the mathematical and optical work of Sir Isaac Newton show true genius. His theological and political ideas weren't worth the paper he wrote them on. Similar accusations might be leveled against Albert Einstein and many others. The general genius isn't so well known because he spreads his abilities over a broad area. Some, like Leonardo da Vinci, have made a name for themselves, but in general, they have remained in the background. Someone once defined a specialist as a man who learns more and more about less and less until he finally knows everything about nothing. And there is the converse, the general practitioner, who knows less and less about more and more until he finally knows nothing about everything. Both types can produce geniuses, and there is, of course, a broad spectrum in between. Da Vinci, for instance, became famous for his paintings. He concentrated on that field because he knew perfectly well that his designs for such things as airplanes were impracticable at the time, whereas the church would pay for art. Samson Bending was a genius, granted, but he was more toward the special than the general side of the spectrum. His grasp of nuclear physics was far and away beyond that of any other scientist of his day. His ability to handle political and economic relationships was rather feeble. As he sat in his waiting room on that chill day of February 1981, his mind was centered on nuclear physics, not general economics. Not that Bending was oblivious to the power of the great god Ammon. Bending was very fond of money and appreciated the things it could achieve. He simply didn't appreciate the overall power of Ammon. At the moment, he was brooding darkly over the very fact of existence of power utilities and trying to figure out a suitable rejoinder to their coup de démon. And then he heard the whir of helicopter blades over the building. The police had come. He opened the door of the lab building as they came up the steps. There were 2 plainclothes men, the technical squad, Bending knew, and 4 uniformed officers. The plainclothes man in the lead, a tall, rather thin man with dark straight hair and a small mustache, said, "Mr. Bending, I'm Sergeant Ketzel. Mind if the boys take a look at the scene? And I'd like to ask a few questions." "Fine," said Sam Bending. "Come on in." He showed the officers to the lab and, telling them nothing, left them to their work. Then he went into his office, followed by Sergeant Ketzel. The detective took down all the pertinent data that Bending chose to give him, and then asked Bending to go with him to the lab. The other plainclothesman came up to Sergeant Ketzel and Bending as they entered. "Pretty easy to see what happened," he said. "Come on over and take a look." He led them over to the wall where the converter had been hidden. "See," he said, "here's your main power line coming in here. It's been burned off. They shut off the power to cut off the burglar alarm to that safe over there." Ketzel shook his head slowly, but said nothing for the moment. He looked at Bending. "Has the safe been robbed?" "I don't know," Bending admitted. "I didn't touch it after I saw all this wreckage." Ketzel told a couple of the uniformed men to go over the safe for evidence. While they waited, Bending looked again at the hole in the wall where the converter had been. And it suddenly struck him that, even if he had reported the loss of the converter to the police, it would be hard to prove. The thief had taken care to burn off the ends of the old leads that had originally come into the building. Bending himself had cut them a week before to install the converter. Had they been left as they were, Bending could have proved by the oxidation of the surface that they had been cut a long time before the leads on this side of the converter. But both had been carefully fused by a torch. "Nothing on the safe," said one of the officers. "No prints at any rate. Micros might show glove or cloth traces, but—" He shrugged. "Would you mind opening the safe, Mr. Bending?" Sergeant Ketzel asked. "Certainly," Bending said. He wondered if the safe had been robbed. In the certainty that it was only the converter that the burglars had been after, he hadn't even thought about the safe. Bending touched the handle, turned it a trifle, and the door swung open easily in his hand. "It wasn't even locked," Bending said, almost to himself. He looked inside. The safe had been thoroughly gone through, but as far as Bending could see, There were no papers missing. "Don't touch anything in there, Mr. Bending," said Ketzel. "Just tell us as much as you can by looking at it." "The papers have been disturbed," Bending said carefully, "but I don't think anything is missing except the petty cash box." "Uh-huh," Ketzel grunted significantly. "Petty cash box? About how much was in it, Mr. Bending?" "3,000 or 4,000, I imagine. You'll have to ask Jim Luckman, my business manager. He keeps track of things like that." "3,000 or 4,000 in petty cash?" Ketzel asked, as though he'd prefer Bending to correct the figure to 200 or 300. "About that. Sometimes we have to order equipment of one kind or another in a hurry, and we can usually expedite matters if we can promise cash. You know how it is." Sergeant Ketzel nodded sourly. He evidently knew only too well how it was. Even the most respectable businessmen were doing occasional business with the black market in technological devices. But he didn't say anything to Bending. "What did the cash box look like?" he asked. Bending held out his hands to measure off a distance. "About so long, 10 inches, I guess. Maybe 6 inches wide and 4 deep. Thin sheet steel with a gray crackle finish. There was a lock on it, but it wasn't much of one. Since it was kept in the safe, there was no need for a strong lock." Sergeant Ketzel nodded. "In other words, an ordinary office cash box. No distinguishing marks at all?" "It had Bending Consultants on the top, and underneath that the word Lab in black paint. That Lab was to distinguish it from the petty cash box in the main office." "I see. Do you know anything about the denominations of the bills? Were they marked in any way?" Bending frowned. "I don't know. You'd have to ask Luckman about that, too." "Where is he now?" "Home, I imagine. He isn't due to report for work until 10. "Okay, will you leave word that we want to talk to him when he comes in? It'll take us a while to get all the information we can from the lab here." He looked back at the hole in the wall. "It still doesn't make sense. Why should they go to all that trouble just to shut off a burglar alarm?" He shook his head and went over to where the others were working. It was hours before the police left. And long before they were gone, Sam Bending had begun to wish fervently that he had never called them. He felt that he should have kept his mouth shut and fought Power Utilities on the ground they had chosen. They had known about the converter only 2 weeks, and they had already struck. He tried to remember exactly how the utilities representative had worded what he'd said, and couldn't. Well, there was an easy way to find out. He went over to his files and took out the recording for Friday, 30th of January, 1981. He threaded it through the sound player. He had no particular desire to look at the man's face again, and turned on the machine. The first sentence brought the whole scene back to mind. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Bending," the man whose card had announced him as Richard Olcott. He was a rather average-sized man with a 50-ish face, graying hair that was beginning to thin, and an expression like that of a friendly poker player, pleasant but inscrutable. "I always have time to see a representative of Power Utilities, Mr. Olcott," Bending said, "though I must admit that I'm more used to dealing with various engineers who work for your subsidiaries." "Not subsidiaries, please," Olcott admonished in a friendly tone. "Like the Bell Telephone Company, Power Utilities is actually a group of independent but mutually cooperative companies organized under a parent company." Bending grinned. "I stand corrected. What did you have on your mind, Mr. Olcott?" Olcott's hesitation was of half-second duration, but it was perceptible. "Mr. Bending," he began, "I understand that you have been, working on a new and, radically different method of power generation. Is that substantially correct?" Bending looked at the man, his blocky, big-jawed face expressionless. "I've been doing experimenting with power generators, yes," he said after a moment. "That's my business." "Oh, quite. I understand that," Olcott said hurriedly. "I took the trouble to look up your record before I came. I'm well aware of the invaluable work you've done in the power field." "Thank you," Bending said agreeably. He waited to see what the other would say next. It was his move. "However," Olcott said, "that's not the sort of thing I was referring to." He leaned forward in his chair, and his bright gray eyes seemed to take on a new life. His manner seemed to alter subtly. "Let me put our cards on the table, Mr. Bending. We understand that you have designed and are experimenting with an amazingly compact power source. We understand that little remains, but to get the bugs out of your pilot model. Naturally, we are interested. Our business is supplying the nation with power. Anything from a new type solar battery on up is of interest to us." He stopped, waiting for Bending to speak. Bending obliged. "I see Petterneck let the cat out of the bag prematurely," he said with a smile. "I hadn't intended to spring it until it was a polished work of engineering art. It's been more of a hobby than anything else, you see." Olcott smiled disarmingly. "I'm not acquainted with Mr. Petterneck. To be quite honest, I have no idea where our engineers picked up the information." "He's an engineer," Bending said. "Friends of mine. He probably got a little enthusiastic in a conversation with one of your boys. He seemed quite impressed by my converter." "Possibly that is the explanation." Olcott paused. "Converter, you say?" "That's what you call it." "That's right. I couldn't think up any fancier name for it. Oh, I suppose I could have, but I didn't want anything too descriptive." "And the word converter isn't descriptive." "Hardly," said Bending with a short laugh. "Every power supply is a converter of some kind. A nickel-cadmium battery converts chemical energy into electrical energy. A solar battery converts radiation into electrical current. The old-fashioned oil or coal-burning power plants converted chemical energy into heat energy, converted that into kinetic energy, and that in turn was converted into electrical energy. The heavy metal atomic plant does almost the same thing, except that it uses nuclear reactions instead of chemical reactions to produce the heat. The stellarator is a converter, too. About the only exception I can think of is the electrostatic condenser, and you could say that it converts static electricity into a current flow if you wanted to stretch a point. On the other hand, a condenser isn't usually considered as a power supplier." Olcott chuckled. "I see your point. Could you give me a rough idea of the principle on which your converter operates?" Bending allowed himself a thoughtful frown. "I'd rather not just now, Mr. Olcott. As I said, I want to sort of spring this full-blown on the world." He grinned. He looked like a small boy who had just discovered that people liked him. But it was a calculated expression, not an automatic one. Olcott looked into Bending's eyes without seeing them. He ran his tongue carefully over the inside of his teeth before he spoke. "Mr. Bending." Pause. "Mr. Bending, we, and by we, I mean, of course, power utilities, have heard a great deal about this converter." His chocolate-brown eyes bored deep into the gray eyes of Samson Bending. "Frankly," he continued, "we are inclined to discount 90% of the rumors that come to us. Most of them are based on purely crackpot ideas. Nonetheless, we investigate them. If someone does discover a new process of producing power, we can't afford to be blind to new ideas just because they happen to come from, unorthodox sources. You, Mr. Bending, are an unusual case. Any rumor concerning your work, no matter how fantastic, is worth looking into on your reputation alone, even though the claims may be utterly absurd." "I have made no claims," Bending interposed. Olcott raised a lean hand. "I understand that, Mr. Bending. Nonetheless, others, who may or may not know what they are talking about, have made this claim for you." Olcott settled back in his chair and folded his hands across his slight paunch. "You've worked with us before, Mr. Bending. You know that we can, and do, pay well for advances in the power field, which are contributed by our engineers. As you know, our contract is the standard one. Any discovery made by an engineer while in our employ is automatically ours. Nonetheless, we give such men a handsome royalty." He paused, opened his briefcase, and pulled out a notebook. After referring to it, he looked up at Bending and said, "You yourself have benefited by this policy. According to our records, you are drawing royalties from 3 patented improvements in the stellarator, which were discovered at times when you were employed by us, or rather, by one of our associative corporations, in an advisory capacity. Those discoveries were, by contract, ours. By law, we could use them as we saw fit without recompense to you, other than our regular fee. Nonetheless, we chose to pay you a royalty because that is our normal policy with all our engineers and scientific research men. We find it more expedient to operate thus." Bending was getting a little tired of Olcott's "nonetheless," but he didn't show it. "Are you trying to say that my converter was invented during my employ with your company, Mr. Olcott?" Olcott cleared his throat and shook his head. "Not necessarily. It is true that we might have a case on those grounds, but under the circumstances, we feel it inexpedient to pursue such a course." "Which means," Bending thought, "that you don't have a case at all." "Then just what are you driving at, Mr. Olcott?" he asked aloud. "I'll put my cards on the table, Mr. Bending," Olcott said. "You've already said that," Bending thought, "and I've seen no evidence of it." "Go ahead," he said. "Thank you." He cleared his throat again. "If your invention is, worthwhile, we are prepared to negotiate with you for use and or purchase of it." Bending had always disliked people who said or wrote and or, but he had no desire to antagonize the Power Utilities representative by showing personal pique. "Let me understand you clearly," he said. "Power Utilities wants to buy my rights to the converter, right?" Olcott cleared his throat a third time. "In a word, yes, provided, of course, that it is actually worth our while. Remember, we know almost nothing about it. The claims made for it by our anonymous informer are, rather fantastic, but your reputation—" He let the sentence hang. Bending was not at all immune to flattery. He grinned. "Do you mean that you came to me to talk about buying an invention you weren't even sure existed, just because of my reputation?" "Frankly, yes," said Olcott. "Your reputation is, shall we say, a good one in power engineering circles." "Are you an engineer?" Bending asked suddenly. Olcott blinked. "Why, no, I am not. I'm a lawyer. I thought you understood that." "Sorry," Bending said. "I didn't. Most of the financial work around here is done through my Mr. Luckman. I'm not acquainted with the monetary end of the business." Olcott smiled. "Quite all right. Evidently I am not as well known to you as you are to me. Not that it matters. Why did you ask?" Bending stood up. "I'm going to show you something, Mr. Olcott," he said. "Would you care to come with me to the lab?" Olcott was on his feet in a second. "I'd be glad to, Mr. Bending." Bending led the man into the lab. "Over here," he said. At the far end of the laboratory was a thick-legged table cluttered with lengths of wire, vacuum tubes, transistors, a soldering gun, a couple of meters, and the other various paraphernalia of an electronics workshop. In the center of the table, surrounded by the clutter, sat an oblong box. It didn't look like much. It was just an 18 by 12 by 10 box made of black plastic, featureless, except for a couple of dials and knobs on the top of it and a pair of copper studs sticking out of the end. Still, Olcott didn't look skeptical, nor surprised. Evidently, his informant had had plenty of information, or else his poker face was better than Bending had thought. "This is your pilot model?" Olcott asked. "One of them, yes. Want to watch it go through its paces?" "Very much." "Okay. First, though, just how good is your technical education? I mean, how basic do I have to get?" Sam Bending was not exactly a diplomat. Olcott, however, didn't look offended. "Let's say that if you keep it on the level of college freshman physics, I'll get the general drift. All right?" "Sure. I don't intend to get any more technical than that anyway. I'm going to tell you what the converter does, not how." "Fair enough, for the moment. Go ahead." Right. Sam flipped a switch on the top of the box. Takes a minute or so to warm up, he said. When the minute or so had passed, Bending, who had been watching the meters on the top of the machine, said, "See this?" He pointed at a dial face. "That's the voltage. It's controlled by this vernier knob here." He turned the knob, and the needle on the voltmeter moved obligingly upwards. "Anything from 10 to 1,000 volts," he said, "easily adjusted to suit your taste." "I don't think I'd like the taste of 1,000 volts," Olcott said solemnly. "Might affect the tongue adversely." Olcott didn't look particularly impressed. Why should he? Anyone can build a machine that can generate high voltage. "Is that AC or DC?" he asked. "DC," said Bending, "but it can easily be converted to AC. Depends on what you want to use it for." Olcott nodded. "How much power does that thing deliver?" Sam Bending had been waiting for that question. He delivered his answer with all the nonchalance of a man dropping a burnt match in an ash tray. 500 horsepower. Olcott's face simply couldn't hold its expressionless expression against something like that. His lips twitched, and his eyes blinked. 500 what? "I will not make the obvious pun," said Bending. "I said 500 horsepower, unquote. About 375 kilowatts maximum." Olcott appeared to be unable to say anything. He simply stared at the small, innocuous-looking converter. Bending was unable to decide whether Olcott was overawed by the truth or simply stricken dumb by what must sound like a monstrous lie. Olcott licked his lips with the tip of his small pink tongue. 500 horsepower. He took a deep breath. "No wonder those copper studs are so thick." "Yeah," said Bending. "If I short 'em across at low voltage, they get hot." "Short them across?" Olcott's voice sounded harsh. Bending was in his seventh heaven, and he showed it. His grin was running as high an energy output as that he claimed for the converter. Sure, the amperage is self-limiting. You can only draw about 400 amps off the thing, no matter how low you put the voltage. When I said 500 HP, I meant at 1,000 volts. As a matter of fact, the available power in horsepower is roughly half the voltage, but that only applies to this small model. A bigger one could supply more, of course. "What does it weigh?" asked Olcott, in a hushed voice. "Little over 100 pounds, Bending said. This concludes the first part of 3 total of Damned If You Don't by Randall Garrett, produced by Best Audiobooks for free.